Hatchet Chapter 17. Let's do it. He turned back to the campsite and looked to the wreckage. He had a lot to do. Rebuild a shelter, get a new fire going, some food, get ready to find some food, make weapons. He had to work slowly because his ribs hurt. First things first, he tried to find some dry grass and twigs. Peeled the bark from the nearby birch to shred into the fire nest. He worked slowly, but even so, with his new skill, he had a fire going in less than an hour. The flames cut the cool, damp morning. It crackled and did much to bring his spirits up, not to mention chasing away those incessant mosquitoes. With the fire going, he searched for dry wood. The rain had driven the water into virtually all the wood that he could find, and at last located some in a thick evergreen where the top branches had covered the lower dead ones, keeping them dry. He had great difficulty breaking them, not being able to pull much with his arm or chest muscles, but finally got enough to keep the fire going all day and into the night. With that, he rested a bit. He eased his chest and then set about getting a shelter squared away. Much of the wood from his original wall was still nearby, and up in the back of the ridge, he actually found a major section of the weave still intact. The wind had torn it out, lifted it, and thrown it to the top of the ridge. And Brian felt lucky once more they had not been killed or seriously injured, which would have been the same, he thought. If he couldn't hunt, he would die. If he were injured badly, he would not be able to hunt. He jerked and dragged the wood around until the wall, until it was once more in place, crudely, but he could improve it later. He had no trouble finding enough pine boughs to make a new bed. The storm had torn the forest to pieces. Up in the back of the ridge, it looked like a giant had become angry and used some kind of massive meat grinder on the trees. Huge pines were twisted or snapped in half, blown sideways. The ground was so littered with limbs and treetops sticking every which way that it was hard to get through. He pulled enough thick limbs for a bed, green and spicy with new broken sap smell, and by evening he was exhausted, hungry, and hurting. But he had something close to a place to live again, a place to be. Tomorrow, he thought, as he lay back in the darkness, tomorrow, maybe the fish would be back and he would make a spear, a new bow, and get some food. Tomorrow, he would find food and redefine the camp, bring things back to sanity from the completely insane day. He faced the fire, curving his body, rested his head on his arm, and began to sleep with a picture came to his head. The tail of the plane sticking out into the water. There it was. The tail sticking up, and inside the plane, near the tail somewhere, was the survival pack. It must have survived the crash because the plane's main body was still intact. That was the picture. The tail sticking up and the survival pack inside, right there in his mind. As he dozed, his eyes snapped open. If I could get that pack, he thought, oh, if I could get that pack, it'd probably have food and knives and matches. It might even have a sleeping bag and fishing gear. Oh, it must have so many wonderful things. If I could get that pack and just get some of those things, I would be rich, so rich, I would get a pack. Tomorrow, he watched the flames and smiled. Tomorrow, I'll see. All things come tomorrow. He slept deep and down with only the picture of the plane sticking in his mind. A healing sleep. In the morning, he rolled out before true light. In the gray dawn, he built up the fire, found more wood for the day, feeling almost chipper because his ribs were much better now. With camp ready for the day, he looked at the lake. Part of him half expected the plane tail to be gone, sunk back down into the depths, but he saw it was still there. It didn't seem to have moved at all. He looked down at his feet and saw that there were some fish in his fish pen looking for tiny bits of bait still left before the wind came. He fought impatience to get the plane project and remembered what he had learned. First food, because food made strength. First food, he thought, then action. There were fish at hand here. He thought he might be able to get anything from the plane. That was all a dream. The fish were real, and his stomach, even his new shrunken stomach, was sending signals that it was savagely empty. He made a fish spear with 2 points, not peeling the bark all the way back, but just working on the pointed end. It took him an hour or so, and all the time he worked, he sat looking at the tail of the plane sticking up in the air. His hands working on the spear, his mind working on the problem of the plane. When the spear was done, although still crude, he jammed the wedge between the points to spread them apart and went to the fish pond. There were not clouds of fish, but at least 10, and he picked one of the larger ones, a round fish, almost about 6 inches. And he put the spear point in the water, held it, thrust with a flicking motion of his wrist when the fish was just above the point. The fish was pinned neatly, and he took 2 more with the same ease, carried all 3 back up to the fire. He had a fish board now, a piece of wood that he had flattened with a hatchet. He had leaned it up against the fire for cooking fish, so he didn't have to hold the stick all the time. He put the 3 fish on the board, pushed the sharpened pegs through their tails, into the cracks on the cooking board, and propped it next to the reddest part of the coals. In moments, the fish were hissing and cooking with the heat. And as soon as they were done, or when he could stand the smell no longer, he picked the steaming meat from under the loosened skin and ate it. The fish did not fill him, did not even come close. Fish meat was too light for him for that, but they gave him strength. He could feel it moving into his arms and legs, and he began to work on the plane project. While making the spear, he decided that what he would have to do would be to make a raft and push paddle the raft of the plane and tie it there for some working base. Somehow, he would have to get into the tail, inside the plane, rip or cut it away his way in. However he did it, he would need an operating base of some kind, like a raft, which he found ruefully was much easier said than done. There were plenty of logs lying around. The shore was littered with driftwood, new and old, tossed up and scattered by the tornado, and it was a simple matter of finding 4 of them about the same length to pull them together. Keeping them together, that was the problem. Without rope or cross pieces or nails or logs, just rolled and separated. He tried wedging them together, crossing them over one another. Nothing seemed to work. And he was able to stay. He needed a stable platform to get the job done. It was becoming frustrating, and he had a momentary loss of temper, as he would have done in the past when he was the other person. At that point, he sat back on the beach, studied the problem again. Sense. He had to use his sense. That was all it took to solve problems. Just some sense. It came then. The log that he had selected were smooth, round, and had no limbs. What he needed were logs with limbs sticking out. Then he could cross the limbs of one log over the limbs of another and weave them together as he had done his wall, the food shelf cover, the fish gate. He scanned the area above the beach and found 4 dry treetops that had been broken off by the storm. These had limbs, and he dragged them down to the work area at the water's edge and fitted them together. It took most of the day. The limbs were cluttered and stuck in any which way he could have cut one to make another fit, then cut one from another log and came down to the first one, then still another from a third log and would have pulled it in. But at last, in the late afternoon, he was done, and the raft, which he called Brush Pile 1 for its looks, hung together even though he pulled at it into the water off the beach. It floated well, if low in the water. In excitement, he started for the plane. He could not stand it, but he'd have to swim alongside. He was out chest depth when he realized he had no way to keep the raft to the plane. He needed some way to tie it in place so he could work from it. And for a moment, he was stymied. He had no rope, only the bowstring and the other cut shoestrings of the tennis shoes, which were now looking close to dead, his toes showing the tops. Then he remembered the windbreaker, and he found the tattered part that he used for an arrow pouch. He tore it into narrow strips, tied them together to make a rope or a tie down about 4 feet long. It wasn't strong, and he couldn't use it to pull a Tarzan and swing from a tree, but it would hold the raft to the plane. Once more, he slid the raft off the beach, out into the water until it was chest deep. He had left his tennis shoes at the shelter, and when he felt the sand turn to mud between his toes, he kicked off from the bottom and he began to swim. Pushing the raft, he figured, was about like trying to push an aircraft carrier. All the branches that struck down to the water dragged and pulled. The logs themselves fought of any forward motion. And he hadn't gone 20 feet when he realized it was going to be much harder than he thought it would be to get the raft to the plane. It barely moved. And if he kept going this way, he would just about reach the plane at dark. He decided to turn around again. Spend the night, start early in the morning. He pulled the raft once more up onto the sand, scraped it dry with his hand. Patience. He was better now, but impatience still ground at him a bit as he sat at the edge of the fish pond with his new spear and took 3 more fish, cooked them up and ate them, which helped him pass the time until dark. He also dragged in more wood, endless wood, then relaxed and watched the sun set over the trees in the back of the ridge. West, he thought. I'm watching the sun set in the west. And that was the way north, where his father was. That was the way east, and that was the way south. And somewhere to the south and east was his mother would be. The news would be on television. He could visualize more easily his mother doing things than his father because he had never been to where his father had lived. Now, he knew everything about how his mother lived. She would have a small television on the kitchen counter, and she'd be watching the news, talking about how awful it was in South Africa or how cute the baby in the commercial looked, talking and making sounds and cooking sounds. And he jerked his mind back to the lake. There was great beauty here, almost unbelievable beauty. The sun exploded in the sky, just blew it up with a setting color. The color came down to the water of the lake, lit the trees, amazing beauty. And he wished that he could share it all with somebody and say, look there, over there. See that? Even alone, it was beautiful. And he fed the fire to cut the night chill. There it is again, he thought, in the late summer chill. To the air, the smell of fall. He went to sleep thinking the kind of reverse question. He did not know if he could ever get out of this, if he could see how it might be, but if he did somehow and get home, he'd go back to living the way that he had lived. Would it be just the opposite? Would he be sitting watching television and suddenly think about the sunset up on the back of the ridge and wonder how the color looked on the lake? In the morning chill, the more pronounced, he could see a tiny wisp of vapor from his breath. He threw wood on the fire and blew on it until it flamed. Then he banked the flames into the last and went down to the lake. Perhaps because the air was so cool, the water felt warm as he waded in. He made sure the hatchet was still on his belt and the raft still held together. And then he set out, pushing the raft and kicking, swimming toward the tail of the plane. As before, it was very hard going. Once an eddy of breeze came up against him, he seemed to be standing still, and by the time that he was close enough to the tail to see the rivulets of the aluminum, he had pushed and kicked for over 2 hours, was nearly exhausted, and wished that he had taken some time to get a fish or two to have breakfast. He was also wrinkled as a prune, ready for a break. The tail looked much larger. And when he got next to it with a major part of the vertical stabilizer showing, perhaps half of the elevators, only a short piece of the top of the fuselage, the plane's body toward the tail, was out of the water. Just a curve of aluminum. And at first, there was no place to tie the raft. But he pulled himself up along the elevators to the end, and there he found a gap that went in up by the hinges where he could feed his rope through. With the raft secure, he climbed on top of it and lay on his back for 15 minutes, resting and letting the sun warm him. The job, he thought, looked impossible. To have any chance of success, he would have to be strong when he started. Somehow he had to get inside the plane. All openings, even the small rear cargo hatch, were underwater, so he couldn't get in them without diving and coming up inside the plane, where he would be trapped. He shuddered at the thought, and then he remembered what was in the front of the plane. Down in the bottom of the lake, still strapped in the seat, the body of the pilot. Sitting there in the water, Brian could see him. The big man with his hair waving in the current, his eyes open. Stop, he thought. Stop now. Stop that thinking. He was nearly at the point of swimming back to the shore and forgetting the whole thing, but the image of the survival pack, that kept him. If he could get it out of the plane, or if he could just get into it and pull something out, a candy bar, even that, just a candy bar would be worth it. But how to get inside the plane? He rolled off the raft and he pulled himself around the plane. No openings. 3 times he put his face down in the water, opened his eyes and looked down. The water was murky, but he could see perhaps 6 feet, and there was obviously no way to get into the plane. He was blocked.